Thomas, a black farmer with sun-kissed skin, stepped out of his weathered pickup truck in front of the airplane showroom at the Central Airport. His muddy boots, faded cap, and worn checkered shirt contrasted sharply with the luxurious surroundings. Today he aimed to fulfill his lifelong dream, owning a private jet. As he entered, the gleaming aircraft lined up like art pieces caught his eye. His footsteps echoed on the polished marble floor, drawing attention. However, the gazes he received were filled with cold judgment and disdain. Salespeople in sharp suits scrutinized him, and a young manager frowned, incredulous that someone like Thomas would enter their showroom. Well-dressed customers whispered among themselves, their remarks laced with mockery. Thomas felt the weight of every glance and whisper, but held his head high. He knew he didn't fit the typical image of a jet buyer, no tailored suit, expensive watch, or luxury car, but that didn't deter him. He approached a sleek jet, its polished exterior gleaming under the lights. Touching the plane's body, he admired its craftsmanship, seeing it as a symbol of his hard-earned success. In the corner, a group of customers exchanged glances, their whispers growing louder. A middle-aged man muttered, "What does he think he's doing?" loud enough for Thomas to hear. Thomas clenched his fists, steadying his nerves, but remained silent, reminding himself he had every right to be there. Greg, a young salesman with slick back hair and a perfectly pressed suit, noticed Thomas and approached him, his disdain evident. Crossing his arms, Greg sneered, "Excuse me, are you sure you're in the right place? This is an airplane showroom, not a gas station." His words were sharp, laced with insult. Thomas met Greg's gaze but chose silence, his hand resting on the plane's surface for strength. Greg stepped closer, invading Thomas's personal space, and continued, "I think you might find something more fitting over at the used car parts store. This place is for people who know what they're doing and have the means. You get what I'm saying?" Others in the showroom began to notice the exchange, casting discreet glances. A woman leaned toward her companion and whispered, "He must not know where he is. Looks like he just stepped off a muddy field." Thomas heard the murmurs, but remained silent, understanding that reacting would only reinforce their stereotypes. Greg, sensing no retaliation, assumed he had the upper hand. Smirking, he drawled, "Do you even want to know the price of this plane? This isn't something someone like you can easily afford. I'd suggest you save your time and hours." Thomas stood taller, his eyes gleaming with determination. He didn't need to prove himself to Greg or anyone else. Yet he couldn't have known that an even greater challenge awaited him. As Thomas admired the airplane, the murmurs grew louder. A woman near the reception desk, dressed in an expensive outfit, muttered, "He's probably just here to take pictures." An older man seated nearby chuckled, "Pictures? I bet he thinks this is some kind of giveaway." Thomas felt every judgmental gaze. A young man near the counter sneered, "Look at the way he's dressed, bet he thinks he belongs here, what a joke." Another customer, a middle-aged man with silver hair, shook his head, "Maybe he's here to apply for a cleaning job, probably wants to polish the planes." Laughter followed. Some comments carried racial undertones. A woman near a smaller aircraft shrugged, "I don't think this is a place for someone like him. Maybe he should stick to working in the fields." These words cut deep, attacking Thomas's identity as a black man who had worked tirelessly for his achievements. Despite the isolation he felt, Thomas took a deep breath, suppressing his emotions. He didn't respond or leave as they might have expected. Instead, he walked slowly toward the reception desk, his resolve unshaken. At the desk, he was met by Linda, a receptionist with a forced smile. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone lacking warmth. "Yes," Thomas replied calmly. "I'd like to inquire about purchasing a jet." Linda's eyebrows raised slightly. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but I was hoping someone could assist me." She glanced around, spotting Greg, and waved him over. "Greg will help you." Greg approached, his earlier disdain replaced with a professional facade. "How can I assist you today?" Thomas maintained his composure. "I'm interested in purchasing this jet. Could you provide me with the details?" Greg's eyes narrowed slightly. "This model starts at $5 million. Are you sure this is within your budget?" Thomas reached into his pocket, pulling out a checkbook. "I'm prepared to make the purchase today." The room grew silent as onlookers watched the exchange. Greg hesitated, then forced a smile. "Of course, sir, let's discuss the details in my office." As they walked toward the office, whispers filled the showroom. "Did you see that?" one customer murmured. "He actually has the money." Inside the office, Greg offered Thomas a seat. "I apologize for any earlier misunderstanding," he said, his tone now respectful. Thomas nodded. "I understand, but it's important to treat every potential customer with respect, regardless of their appearance." Greg swallowed hard. "You're absolutely right. Let's proceed with the paperwork." As Thomas finalized the purchase, the atmosphere in the showroom shifted. The staff and customers realized their prejudiced assumptions had been wrong. Thomas's determination and grace had challenged their biases, leaving a lasting impression. Without uttering a word of retaliation, Thomas had made a powerful statement. Dignity and perseverance can break down even the most stubborn walls of prejudice. Thomas stood in the showroom, feeling the weight of the stares and whispers around him. He had come with the intention of purchasing an airplane, a dream he had nurtured for years. However, the condescending attitudes of the staff and other customers made him question his place there. As he approached one of the planes, a staff member named Greg, who had mocked him earlier, reappeared with a malicious smirk. "Back again? What do you want this time?" Greg's tone was as condescending as before. "I thought we made it clear this isn't the place for you. These planes aren't just for looking at." Thomas stared at Greg without flinching. There was no anger in his eyes, only resolve. "I'm not here just to look," he replied, his voice low and deliberate, emphasizing every word. Before he could say more, another sneer echoed from the corner of the room. "Yeah, let him dream," a male voice said louder than before. "That's probably all he's good for." Thomas felt his chest tighten, his hands clenched not out of rage, but as an effort to keep control. He knew that losing his temper would only confirm their beliefs that he didn't belong there. But every cutting remark was like a wave crashing against him, testing the limits of his composure. Even so, a spark of determination ignited within him. It wasn't anger but an unyielding resolve. He knew he couldn't let these words define him or deter him. Yet the question remained, how could he face this situation while preserving his dignity? That was the challenge he would have to confront with every step he took. Thomas stood still, his eyes trying to maintain composure amidst the growing jeers. He felt as though every gaze in the room was drilling into him, as if they were waiting for him to crumble or walk away. Then, unexpectedly, he felt a gentle pat on his shoulder from behind. The gesture startled him just enough. He turned around. Standing before him was a familiar face. "Thomas, I didn't expect to see you here," a warm and friendly voice broke through the tense atmosphere. It was James, an old friend from high school. Like Thomas, James was also black, but his career path had taken him to a different station in life. His neatly trimmed hair, expensive gray suit, and polished leather shoes sharply contrasted with Thomas's simpler appearance. Thomas stared at James for a few moments before exclaiming, "James, is it really you?" A rare smile lit up his face, one that hadn't appeared all day. James smiled back, pulling Thomas into a friendly hug. His presence seemed to soften the tense atmosphere around them slightly, though the scrutinizing eyes of the room hadn't yet turned away from the pair. "What are you doing here?" James asked, his tone a mix of curiosity and encouragement. "Don't tell me you're here to buy a plane?" He chuckled lightly, his eyes sparkling with respect rather than skepticism, something Thomas hadn't encountered from anyone else in the room. Thomas hesitated briefly, a flicker of embarrassment creeping into his heart. He felt the stark difference between himself and James, not just in appearance, but in how James carried himself with such confidence in an environment like this, as though it belonged to him. Finally, Thomas answered honestly, "Actually, yes, I'm here to buy a plane, but it seems like nobody here believes I can." James glanced around at the people nearby, his eyes quickly sharpening. "The people here," he said with a firm tone, "you don't need to worry about them, they don't understand you, and honestly, they don't matter." His voice was resolute but carried an undertone of encouragement. Thomas gave a slight nod, though a hint of unease lingered in his eyes. "Didn't you hear what they were saying?" he asked, his voice dropping slightly. "The insults, those looks, they make me feel like I don't belong here." James placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder and looked him straight in the eye. "Thomas, remember who you are. You've worked hard your entire life to get here. Their words don't define your worth, and they certainly can't stop you from achieving your dream." He paused, a smile returning to his face. "And I'm here to make sure you don't give up." James's words were like a small flame igniting confidence within Thomas. He felt the warmth of friendship, a feeling he hadn't experienced during this long pressure-filled day. The two friends began chatting for a while, and Thomas felt some of the tension in his chest ease. Yet James's presence also seemed to draw increasing attention from those around them. From across the room, Greg stood with his arms crossed, his icy gaze fixed on James and Thomas. A faint smirk of disdain crept across his face. Greg wasn't just annoyed that Thomas was still here. James's arrival, with his evident success and self-assurance, only added to Greg's irritation. "Looks like his friend's trying to act important too," Greg remarked to a colleague nearby, loud enough for others to hear. A few attendees began murmuring again, no longer focusing solely on Thomas, but now turning their scrutiny toward James as well. Thomas noticed this and leaned closer to James, speaking softly. "You know, sometimes I wonder if it's even worth it. Those looks, they make me feel like I'm standing on a battlefield." Thomas, a black farmer with sun-kissed skin, stepped out of his battered pickup truck in front of the airplane showroom at the Central Airport. His muddy boots, faded cap and worn-out checkered shirt made him stand out starkly against the luxurious and modern surroundings. But he didn't care about that. Today was the day he decided to make his lifelong dream a reality, owning a private jet. As Thomas walked inside, gleaming aircraft were lined up like works of art. His footsteps echoed on the polished marble floor, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. Yet the attention he received wasn't curiosity or respect, it was cold judgment mingled with disdain. Salespeople in sharp suits looked him up and down. A young man, likely the manager, frowned and shook his head slightly, incredulous that someone like Thomas would dare set foot here. Customers dressed to the nines didn't bother to hide their annoyance. A woman standing near the reception desk whispered to the person next to her, "What's he doing here? He looks like he just walked off a farm." A soft chuckle followed her remark. Thomas felt every glance, every whisper, but instead of backing down, he held his head high and kept his gaze steady. He knew he didn't fit the typical image of someone buying a jet, no custom-tailored suit, no expensive watch, and no luxury car, but that didn't bother him. He had a dream, and today he had the means to make it come true. Approaching the display area, Thomas stopped in front of a small but elegant jet, its polished metal exterior gleaming under the overhead lights. He reached out to touch the plane's body, feeling the perfection of its craftsmanship. This wasn't just a mode of transport to him, it was a symbol of the hard work and success he had earned. In the corner of the room, a group of customers began exchanging glances, their whispers growing louder. "What does he think he's doing?" muttered a middle-aged man, loud enough for Thomas to hear. "Probably imagining he's a pilot." Thomas froze for a moment, his fists clenching as he steadied his nerves. He didn't respond, nor did he walk away. Instead, he remained where he was, gazing at the jet, silently reminding himself that he had every right to be there, just as much as anyone else. Thomas stood there, his eyes tracing every intricate detail of the airplane, his heart brimming with thoughts of the dream he had nurtured for so long. On the other side of the room, however, Greg, a young salesman, was fixated on Thomas. Greg, with his slicked back hair, perfectly pressed suit, and air of self-assurance fitting for this glitzy world, didn't bother to hide the disdain etched across his face as he looked at Thomas. Greg began to approach Thomas slowly, each deliberate step echoing like a calculated assertion of dominance. His lips curled into a smirk, his cold eyes silently declaring that Thomas didn't belong here. When he was close enough, Greg crossed his arms over his chest, tilted his head slightly, and began to speak. "Excuse me, are you sure you're in the right place?" Greg's tone was a blend of mockery and derision. His gaze swept over Thomas, from the faded hat perched on his head to the simple shirt he wore, and finally to the mud-smeared boots on his feet. "This is an airplane showroom, not a gas station." The words were not just sharp, they were laced with outright insult. Greg didn't need to say much more to make his disdain crystal clear. Thomas slowly turned his head, his eyes meeting Greg's. But instead of retorting, he stayed silent, his lips pressed into a thin line, and his hand rested gently on the plane's surface, as if drawing strength from it. His silence wasn't born of weakness, but of a deliberate choice to remain composed. Yet Greg wasn't finished. He took another step closer, breaching Thomas's personal space, clearly attempting to escalate the situation. "I think you might find something more fitting for yourself over at the used car parts store," Greg continued, his voice cutting like a blade. "This place is for people who know what they're doing and actually have the means. Do you get what I'm saying?" Greg's words weren't just insults, they carried an unspoken message. He didn't believe that someone like Thomas, with his rugged appearance and unpolished demeanor, could belong in this lavish environment. Greg was accustomed to dealing with clients who arrived in sharp suits, sporting luxury watches, stepping out of high-end cars. He had no patience or respect for anyone who didn't fit that mold. Other people in the showroom began to notice the exchange. A few customers cast discreet glances in their direction, their eyes a mix of curiosity and amusement, as if they were waiting to see how Thomas would respond. Near the window, a woman leaned toward her companion and whispered, "He must not know where he is, looks like he just stepped off a muddy field." Thomas could hear the murmurs, but he chose to remain silent. He understood that any rash reaction would only reinforce the stereotypes these people already held about him. Instead, he took a deep breath, keeping his gaze calm and his focus unwavering on the one thing that mattered, making his dream a reality. Sensing no immediate retaliation from Thomas, Greg assumed he had the upper hand. His smirk grew wider, dripping with condescension. "Do you even want to know the price of this plane?" Greg drawled, dragging out the words to emphasize the perceived gap between them. "This isn't something someone like you can easily afford. I'd suggest you save your time and hours." Greg's words cut deep, a blatant attack on Thomas's pride. But instead of breaking, Thomas stood taller, his eyes gleaming, with quiet determination. He didn't need to prove himself, not to Greg, not to anyone in the room. Yet he couldn't have known that an even greater challenge awaited him just ahead. Thomas struggled to maintain his focus, despite Greg's disdain lingering like a shadow in the air. He ran his hand across the sleek control panel of the airplane before him, feeling the refinement and modern technology it embodied. Yet the fragile silence was soon shattered by murmurs from other corners of the room. "He's probably just here to take pictures," muttered a woman near the reception desk, her voice dripping with sarcasm. She was dressed in an expensive dress, arms crossed over her chest, as if she already knew the punchline of the comedy unfolding before her. Pictures? I bet he thinks this is some kind of giveaway. An older man seated on a leather chair further back replied with a derisive chuckle. His laughter elicited a few agreeing smirks from those nearby, adding to the oppressive weight of the showroom's atmosphere. Thomas could feel every gaze landing on him, not out of curiosity but judgment and scorn. Some deliberately looked away when he glanced in their direction, but their mocking expressions were hard to miss. The murmurs grew louder, no longer veiled in subtlety. A young man near the reception counter spoke up with a sneer. "Look at the way he's dressed. Bet he thinks he belongs here. What a joke." The remarks didn't end there. Another customer, a middle-aged man with silver hair and thick glasses, shook his head and smirked. "Maybe he's here to apply for a cleaning job, probably wants to polish." Greg stuttered, attempting to steady his voice. "We didn't mean any harm. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding." Misunderstanding? Marcus's tone sharpened. "A misunderstanding that you looked down on my father simply because he was dressed differently. A misunderstanding that you thought you had the right to decide who belongs here." Greg froze, unable to reply. Others in the room, including the customers who had joined in the ridicule, avoided Marcus's piercing gaze. Silence enveloped the space, broken only by Marcus's firm voice. "If there isn't an apology right now, I won't let this slide," Marcus declared. "I'm a lawyer. My father wasn't just insulted, he was subjected to blatant discrimination in a public business setting. I will pursue legal action against you and this company if necessary." A few whispers rippled through the room, but no one dared to oppose him. Greg swallowed hard, his face pale. Finally, he awkwardly bowed his head toward Thomas. "Sir, I apologize if my words offended you." Thomas met Greg's eyes, his expression no longer angry but steady and resolute. "This apology isn't for me, it's a lesson for you all to learn how to treat everyone with respect, no matter how they look or where they come from." Marcus stood silently beside his father, his gaze still stern. He turned to the group of customers who had mocked Thomas earlier. "What about you? Did you think you had the right to laugh at my father just because he's not like you?" No one responded. The middle-aged man who had been the loudest earlier mumbled incoherently before quickly lowering his head. A few others hurriedly found excuses to leave the gallery, unwilling to face Marcus any longer. Marcus turned back to his father and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Dad, let's go, they've seen enough." Yet within Marcus, a fire of resolve continued to burn. He knew this wasn't just a single act of disrespect. It was a deeper issue, one he was determined to fight so that no one would ever dare to look down on his father again. When Thomas and Marcus left the airport, it seemed the matter had ended there. But for Marcus, this was far more than a personal conflict. It was an insult to his father's dignity, honor, and human rights, and he was determined to bring it to light. A few weeks later, a lawsuit was officially filed in the local court. The company owning the aircraft showroom was accused of discriminatory practices and humiliating a customer, specifically Thomas. Marcus led the legal team, crafting a solid case with an arsenal of evidence, witnesses, and compelling arguments. At the first hearing, the courtroom was packed. Representatives of the company, attorneys, and involved employees were all present, including Greg, the man who had directly mocked Thomas. Greg's face was visibly tense as he sat quietly with the company's legal team, avoiding Marcus's piercing gaze. Marcus began his opening statement with a calm but powerful tone. "Your Honor," he said, his eyes scanning the room, "we are here today to shed light on a painful truth. Discrimination not only exists, but is being tolerated in modern business environments. My father, Thomas, was subjected to an unacceptable act, an act no one in this society should have to endure." The company's attorney immediately rose to object. "Your Honor, we believe this case has been exaggerated. The remarks Mr. Thomas overheard were mere misunderstandings, not intended to offend or discriminate." Marcus remained undeterred. "Misunderstandings," he emphasized each syllable, his sharp eyes locking on the opposing team. We have clear evidence that this was no misunderstanding, but a deliberate attempt to humiliate and demean my father, and I will prove that." Marcus signaled for a young woman to take the witness stand. It was Patricia, an employee at the aircraft showroom. She was the only staff member who had discreetly recorded the incident, unable to bear her colleague's mistreatment of Thomas. "Patricia, can you recount what you witnessed that day?" Marcus asked, his voice low yet commanding. Patricia took a deep breath, her gaze briefly landing on Greg, who now looked as though he wanted to shrink into his seat. "I saw everything," she said firmly. "Greg and some customers made discriminatory remarks toward Mr. Thomas. They mocked him for his appearance and profession. I couldn't stay silent, so I secretly recorded the conversation." Marcus nodded, a hint of a confident smile crossing his face. "Do you have that recording?" Patricia nodded and handed her phone to Marcus. He connected it to the courtroom's audio system. As the recording played, the room fell into a heavy silence. The mocking voices of Greg and the customers rang out clearly. "You think you can afford a plain dress like that? Go back to your farm. He probably thinks this is a charity giveaway." Each statement cut through the room like a knife, leaving the air heavy with tension. Greg stared at the table, his face pale, while the company's attorneys tried to maintain composure, though it was evident they had little left to argue. When the recording ended, Marcus stepped forward, addressing the judge directly. "Your Honor, this is not a misunderstanding. This is discrimination, a deliberate assault on my father's dignity. And it's not just my father, Thomas, who is a victim. Anyone who looks different from their ideal customer could easily become a target." The company's lawyer stood to counter. "We do not deny that those remarks were inappropriate, however. The company cannot be held accountable for individual actions that were neither sanctioned nor reflective of management policy." Marcus turned sharply, his gaze like a laser cutting through the opposition's defense. "The company cannot evade responsibility," he said, his tone calm yet razor-sharp. "This isn't just about individual behavior. This is about the environment the company fosters, an environment that tolerates and fails to address such conduct. If the company doesn't take responsibility, then who will?" The judge, seated at the high bench, nodded slowly. "The evidence is very clear," he said gravely. "We will proceed with this case to determine the extent of the company's and the individual's responsibilities, but I must say, what I've heard so far is deeply troubling." The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Marcus turned to look at his father, his eyes filled with determination. Thomas gave a subtle nod, a silent expression of pride in his son. Yet Marcus knew the fight was far from over. This was only the beginning of the journey to justice. When the recording played in the courtroom, all eyes turned toward the speaker. Each sarcastic remark and heavy mockery echoed clearly, unmistakably. "Do you think you can buy a plane in that suit? Go back to your farm. It suits you better. He probably thinks this place gives out freebies." Those words sliced through the air like knives, thickening the atmosphere in the courtroom. They weren't just insults. They carried a distinct prejudice against Thomas, not only for his appearance but also for his background. Thomas's face remained calm, but his hands clenched tightly on his lap, as if to keep himself from showing the pain. Patricia, seated at the witness stand, took a deep breath before speaking. "These words aren't just offensive. They reflect the attitude Mr. Thomas endured the moment he stepped into that showroom. I work there, and I witnessed it all. What you just heard is the truth, and it happens daily too in the courtroom." A middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair rose to his feet, attempting to control the damage. "Your Honor, we do not deny that these remarks are inappropriate," he began. "However, we contend that this was an individual act and does not represent the company's policies or values." Marcus immediately stood, his expression cold and firm. "Does not represent the company?" He emphasized each word, his voice resonating with conviction. Your Honor, this is an environment where such behavior is tolerated. Greg, the salesperson, was not the only one making those comments. He was supported by approving glances from his colleagues and even customers in the showroom. This isn't an isolated incident. It's a systemic issue. The company's lawyers struggled to maintain composure, but their discomfort was evident. We will implement additional training for employees and enforce stricter oversight moving forward, another lawyer said, attempting to redirect the issue. Marcus wasn't about to let them off so easily. Training alone won't suffice, he said, his gaze piercing through the opposing team. My father is not the first person to be treated this way, and unless significant actions are taken, he won't be the last. This company must take responsibility not just for the words spoken, but for the systemic silence that enables such behavior. The judge, an older woman with a stern expression, finally spoke. After listening to the recording and arguments from both sides, the evidence we've just heard clearly demonstrates that Mr. Thomas was subjected to unfair and discriminatory treatment. This cannot be dismissed as an individual's actions. The company has a duty to create a fair business environment, one that does not tolerate such behaviors. She turned to the company's legal team. I advise you to reconsider your stance before we proceed. Do you wish to continue arguing, or would you consider discussing a reasonable settlement? The company's lawyers conferred hurriedly, their concern evident. But Marcus wasn't finished. Your Honor, he said, his voice calm but firm, my father didn't come here for a token apology or some superficial training measures. He came here to reclaim the respect and dignity that were stripped from him, and we won't stop until justice is served. The courtroom fell silent for a moment. Greg sat motionless, his face pale. The company's lawyers exchanged yet another hurried discussion before one of them stood. We are willing to discuss settlement terms, he said, his voice low and reluctant. The judge nodded. Good, we will proceed with settlement discussions in the next session, but let me remind you, if a satisfactory resolution is not reached, this case will proceed to trial, and I will ensure justice is served. Marcus turned to Thomas, a faint smile on his lips. We're on the right track, Dad, he whispered, his eyes shining with pride. But he knew this was just the first step in their fight for justice. The battle was far from over, and he wouldn't stop until everything was set right. On the final morning of the trial, the courtroom was packed. Rows of seats were filled with reporters, witnesses, and curious onlookers drawn by the case that had captivated public attention. Standing at the plaintiff's side, Thomas and Marcus maintained a composed demeanor, though they knew this was the pivotal moment. The judge entered, her expression stern and her gaze sharp, as if she had meticulously weighed every piece of evidence. After a few moments of silence to settle the room, she began to deliver the verdict. Members of the court, after thoroughly reviewing all the evidence and hearing testimonies from both sides, I have reached the conclusion that Mr. Thomas has endured severe discrimination in a public business setting. The recorded statements presented in court are